Dzień dobry Państwa i naszym specjalnym gościem jest dzisiaj pan John Bolton, były doradca do spraw bezpieczeństwa narodowego za czasów prezydentury Donalda Trumpa. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for finding time for our conversation.
Glad to be with you.
So, in your opinion, is it possible that Mr. Trump in the second term, presidential term, can withdraw US from NATO?
Well, I think it's a very real risk. He said several times during his first term that he wanted to withdraw. He repeated it after he left office. I describe in my book the scene at the 2018 NATO summit in Brussels, where he came very close at that meeting, actually, to withdrawing. And as I say, since he's been commenting on what he thinks are NATO's deficiencies since then, that it's very, very likely that early in his term, he would consider withdrawing. So I think people should take it very seriously.
So how it could be looks like, like, I don't know, withdrawal only from the administrative part, or I don't know, like stop the military presence, for example, in the east flank? How it could be work?
Well, there are a lot of possibilities, but I think when he thinks of withdrawing, he means pulling the United States out entirely. And the reason is he doesn't really understand NATO or, in fact, other U.S. alliances. He thinks we're sort of defending Europe because we're nice people, which we are, but we're not. That's not what an alliance is. And since he thinks we're defending you, that you collectively should spend more on defense, or as he puts it, pay more in NATO dues. And he doesn't understand that the strength NATO provides in collective security makes all of us safer, and that we all benefit from it. Many people have said, well, he's just trying to get some of the countries that are not meeting the target they agreed upon in 2014 to spend 2% of GDP on defense. He's just trying to bargain them up to a higher level. And that's not accurate. I mean, I and many others over the years have urged NATO members to spend more on defense because we want a stronger alliance. Trump's urging spending more on defense because he doesn't think many members will do it, and that will provide him with a reason to withdraw.
So how we can mean this statement from the Mr. Trump about he will end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, or if Russia decides to invade other Western NATO states, we will not protect you. So how we can understand, this statement, these words? Maybe you can give some opinion about it.
Well, look, it shows, in my view, both those statements, why Trump's not fit to be president. He didn't know much about national security before he became president in 2017, and in 4 years in office, he didn't learn much, and he hasn't learned much since he left the first term. So the idea that the Russian aggression against Ukraine can be resolved in 24 hours, no serious person believes that. Donald Trump may believe it, but it shows that he's not serious. He hasn't done the work necessary to understand why the conflict occurred, why the Russia's unprovoked aggression is unacceptable, and why Ukraine deserves U.S. support. So this means that if he tried to solve it in 24 hours and it didn't work, that would be a failure. But obviously, it's not Donald Trump's failure because he doesn't fail. So it must be the problem of one of the other people, Zelensky or Putin. And this is where I think danger for Ukraine arises, because I think he's far more likely to say it was Zelensky's fault we couldn't reach agreement to resolve the crisis than it was Putin's.
By the way, Mr. Trump, during his first term, asking you very often about what's happening in Europe, what's happening with NATO, or it was not very interesting topic for him?
Well, he didn't ask about it so much as we brought things to his attention that he needed to consider. We needed his decision on in a variety of areas, particularly dealing with the Russians and the threat that they pose, their efforts to interfere in American and other elections, the instability they were causing in parts of Eastern Central Europe and elsewhere along their periphery, and their activities with China and others. So Trump doesn't have a philosophy, and he doesn't think in what we conventionally call policy terms. He doesn't think ahead especially well. So much of what he was doing was simply reacting to news of events in the external world that, as I say, we brought to his attention because he needed to know about them, and we needed to get decisions that only a president could make on what the U.S. response had to be.
So, in your opinion, Poland and Baltic states can be sure about the U.S. support in case of the full-scale Russian invasion?
Well, as I say, I don't know what Trump will do if he starts to pull out of NATO. I think that would be a very bad sign. I mean, I think my guess is Putin has plenty of other things he might do first in terms of recreating the Russian Empire, which he gave us warning about as far back as 2005 when he said the breakup of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century. It's not the Soviet Union he's trying to recreate, but his view of Russia. And there are plenty of non-NATO members who were former constituents of the Russian Empire that he might look at first. But that's why what happens in Ukraine is so significant. If we can get that right and show that unprovoked aggression is not going to work, then I think it's less likely the Russians would try it elsewhere.
So, using your geopolitical experience, that you see that the world still going to this new Cold War scenario, or it's like multipolar conflicts? Of course, we understand that the U.S. thinking much more about the strategic challenge with China, right, than with Russia. So, what do you can predict in near future if you talk about the geostrategic position of U.S. and also about the NATO and future of this conflicts? Of course, it's hard to find a very clear answer, but I'm very interested about your opinion.
Right. Well, look, I think in the big picture, I think we've entered into a new era in international affairs. I think the post-Cold War era is over. It was kind of a strange interlude after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But I think with the formation of what in effect is a new axis between China and Russia, that we're going to see a very different conduct in foreign affairs. I mean, they've got satellites in effect, outriders like North Korea, Iran, Syria, Belarus, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. And I think they're acting increasingly together. So you can see that Iran and North Korea are aiding Russia in the conduct of its war against Ukraine, that the Chinese are helping launder Russian money and provide them financial support, notwithstanding European and U.S. sanctions. And I think this is going to be an increasing pattern, maybe when we see China make an aggressive move along its very long Indo-Pacific periphery. So as these changes develop, I think we'll see an increasing relationship between events in Europe on the one hand and events in the Indo-Pacific on the other. And I don't think the different pieces of American interest are well tied together. Although we have seen in the most recent NATO meeting, Japan ask for a NATO liaison office to be opened in Tokyo. We see South Korea selling Poland artillery and ammunition. So I think that my hope would be in Europe, people see this broader threat posed by the Beijing-Moscow axis, and that NATO and America's other allies in the Asia-Pacific region can work more closely together. Because when you look at it fundamentally, we're really all facing the same basic threat.
How U.S. can react on the further escalation in the war in Ukraine, if you talk about the near future, but also if you talk about the next few years?
Well, it's hard to imagine at this point Russia having substantial resources to increase its presence or increase the conflict in Ukraine. If they had these resources, I would think they would have been applied earlier. But if we fail in supplying Ukraine with the weapons and ammunition that it needs, even Russia, with all the casualties they've suffered in Ukraine, may yet be able to make substantial advances. So I don't think this is a period where we can say the conflict in Ukraine has been fought to a standstill. There may not be all that much movement on the battlefield, but Putin takes a very long-term view of this. Look, he invaded Ukraine the first time back in 2014, took 10% of the country, waited 8 years, has now taken another 10% of the country. If the war stopped tomorrow, it would just mean that it would give Russia time to regroup and rearm later. So we need to keep this time frame in mind as we look at basically how to find ways to aid Ukraine to remove the Russians from sovereign Ukrainian territory. That's the only way to win the war.
So, which decision about the national security, international position of the US do you expect in the second possible presidential term of Donald Trump?
Look, I'd have to say I'm very worried that he would take an isolationist approach. It's not that Trump thinks in broad strategic or philosophical terms. He does not. But decision by decision, statement by statement during the course of this campaign, he's indicated he wants a lesser American presence in Europe, whether it's full withdrawal from NATO or not. He acts the same way toward our allies in the Pacific, like Japan and South Korea. You know, if he had an encouraging phone call from Xi Jinping after the election, he wouldn't be imposing tariffs on China. He'd be back to trying to negotiate the world's biggest trade deal ever. So it's hard to predict exactly what Trump's direction would be because he doesn't have a direction. He responds episodically and transactionally, and a lot depends on what comes across his desk on any given day.
Many experts, many analysts predict that the US cannot be at the same level involving in many conflicts at the same time. So if something happened in the Far East, for example, between the China and Taiwan, the US presence in Europe will increase very, very, very fast. Decrease very, very fast. So in your opinion, this is the true scenario that this kind of enemies, like competitors, if you talk about the North Korea, China, Iran, Russia, trying to involve US in many places at the same time. If you talk about the military presence, that's why Europe needs to think about the collective own defense, not only count on the US, right?
Yeah. Well, I think Europe should do more on defense. I've said that along with hundreds, probably thousands of other Americans over the years. But we say that to strengthen NATO, whereas Trump says it as a wedge to try and weaken NATO. You know, the fact is those who say we don't have the resources to handle our responsibilities worldwide act as though resources are finite. We spend about 3.5% of our GDP on defense currently. I think that needs to go back up to Reagan era levels, 5 to 6%. It means if you want to reduce deficits, that domestic spending has to come down. That's always a hard thing for politicians to say, but that's what I think we need to do. And by the way, if we go up to 5 or 6% of GDP on defense, Europe shouldn't believe that it's done all it's going to do when it reaches 2%. I think Europe has to be looking in the next 10 years at getting to 3 or probably 4% of GDP. And we have the capability to do that. The idea that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time is a mistake if Congress votes the necessary resources. And I think if we had political leaders who explained why it was necessary, that they would do it and we would have the resources.
We discuss around 75th anniversary of creation of NATO. So in your opinion, this organization, this kind of 30, working very well, or it needs like very fundamental reform or other changes?
Look, I don't think it needs fundamental reform. It does need everybody to step in and do their fair share. That's basically what Trump is complaining about. But as I say, he complains about a lot of other things. He complains about unequal trade deals between the EU and the United States, European dependence on Russian oil and natural gas. He doesn't understand alliances. He doesn't understand the mutual nature of the reinforcing security that alliances provide. So he doesn't really understand how to use NATO itself effectively. But I think that it would be a mistake to believe that U.S. withdrawal would simply require Europe to do more. I think it would fundamentally change the balance of power in Europe. That's why we got involved in wars, hot wars there twice in the 20th century, in the Cold War. And I think it would be a catastrophic mistake if Trump withdrew.
Many politicians in Poland think that the Mr. Trump know our country very well, our politicians, our position, and so on. From your perspective, it could be true that the Mr. Trump could be really interesting about what's happening in Poland, what is the Poland position. Of course, we remember about his only one visit in Warsaw in 2017, when say very big words about the Polish-American relationship, and that's why many Polish, especially right politicians, thinking that he care about Poland. So, in your opinion, is it true, or it's something close to the political fiction?
Well, I think it depends on whether he thinks there's political benefit for Donald Trump in appearing to be pro-Polish, and I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had an effect on that equation, because he is very skeptical, and it's reflected in the difficulty we've been having in getting the additional aid package to Ukraine through Congress. So, you know, it goes to the fundamental point. Trump doesn't have a basic philosophy. If he thinks it benefits him to look like he has a close relationship with Poland, he will act that way. And if it turns out it doesn't have a political benefit for him, he'll do something else.
Last question. In your opinion, Donald Trump changed in last year, even for a little bit, or not? Is it the same person like in 2015, 2016, and he using the same method, and he is the same politician like in the last years, or maybe change it, in your opinion?
No, look, it's the same person. I think we see more of him, and the more we see, the less a lot people like. But I think it's important that many senior advisors who worked with Donald Trump on a daily basis, as I did, but many of them have rejected him as the Republican nominee for president, won't support him, won't endorse him, won't vote for him, because they worry that he's not qualified to be president. And I hope that has an effect. I'm not supporting Biden because I'm not terribly enthusiastic about him either. I think we've gotten a bad choice this November. 70% of the American people in polls said they didn't want to see a Trump versus Biden rematch, and yet that's what we've got. It's not a good sign one way or the other, honestly.
Definitely, this is not a good sign for democracy, but we need to observe what will gonna happen. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Ambassador. Państwa i moim gościem był pan ambasador John Bolton, były doradca do spraw bezpieczeństwa narodowego za czasów prezydentury Donalda Trumpa. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.